If we look at the 60s, the 70s, it was pretty defined. You had two major superpowers. You had the USSR, you had the United States. Over the years, things have become very fluid, especially in the last 6 years after COVID. I mean, if I can use that as kind of the breaking point, the financial world completely changed. This was the first time when economies started collapsing. The IMF had to step in. There was a pandemic. Millions of people died. Then it became even more complex, right? You had Russia invading Ukraine. Again, that whole scenario of the Cold War started. The entire financial architecture of the world, how people do business, has again changed. How do you view that?
I would actually urge you to take one step back for India particularly. If you recall the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008, 2009,
Right.
that in our recent history, that is an important marker.
Right.
And I'll come to COVID in a minute. What has happened is, they call it global financial crisis, but actually it was a transatlantic financial crisis.
It was basically an American crisis.
It was basically American, and to some extent,
You affected a little bit, but I don't know how.
that's right. But they brought in other countries like India and China, and that was around 2010, and particularly with the emergence of the G20 and elevating G20. G20 used to be a finance ministers forum. And that has its roots to the Asian financial crisis of 97, 98. But that's going too far back, perhaps. But if you take 2007, 2008 as a marker where India and Brazil were brought in, and the G20 was elevated to the prime minister or the leaders level, that's when we started seeing the other emerging countries like China, India, say Mexico, Brazil, take a more intentional approach towards global governance, global economy. What is our stake? How does few issues in Europe and the US affect us? So there was a decade between 2010 to 2020 or so, until your marker of COVID, where there was an attempt to take more of a role, attempt by India and other countries, in defining global economy and particularly rules and regulations. Then after COVID, actually a little bit preceding COVID when Trump came in, but around that time, globalization itself started to change. You would notice that we started to have terms like friendshoring and nearshoring and allies and supply chain resilience, all these terms.
And that was pretty much the first time that someone confronted China the way the US did because of Mr. Trump, right?
Exactly.
That also started changing the economic because he put sanctions against China. Of course, Donald Trump also put some, extra duties against Indian goods as well at that point.
That's right. In fact, in 2016, when in Trump 1.2, when he came to power and when he actually imposed these tariffs, it was such a shocker to the world. And then in COVID, all the countries realized the dependency we have on China.
Right. The entire supply chain was...
Yeah. So I think it was only reconfirmed some of our worst fears that we needed a different strategy and we can't have all our eggs in one basket. We needed to have supply chains in which we're a little bit more independent. And so coming to your question where you started with, after COVID, a lot more attention has gone into how do we become more resilient, maybe diversify, have some alternative plans, not only be dependent on one country for our critical minerals or raw materials. And so a different phase of globalization and geoeconomics has started post-COVID. Now, there are 2 or 3 characteristics with which you can define this new phase. One is maintaining some kind of supply chain independence and resiliency. Second is to pay more attention to who our friends and allies are and making sure we do more business with our friends and allies. And 3, also introducing technology into geoeconomics, because more and more geoeconomics is now dependent on scientific and technological innovation. So how do we maintain that kind of economic security? So there's definitely a change after COVID. And India is taking steps to navigate that.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching this clip. As you know, we are taking a deep dive into some complex issues and decoding them for you. So don't forget to check out more content on our channel. And also, we'd love to hear back from you with your comments and your suggestions. So let's explore together.